going on in the world and becoming knowledgeable about the things they need to know in order to engage the lost, especially those who believe in evolution as far as the subject tonight goes. In order to address these, we need to understand that this is a naturalistic philosophy. Its foundation is in atheism, because if the universe exists and that's all there is, and all of this came about by chance, there is no room for God. So you ask the implications for Christians. That's one of the implications. Now let's just look at the examples though, because as Christians, we want to know where the evidence leads. We can be assured that it will lead us back to God.
Right.
But at the same time, with a background in science, I do want to have good reasons for believing what I believe. And so let's talk about the very first one which we addressed, was the embryo similarity. What we find in high school biology textbooks, the ones my students read and are taught from, fortunately they have a Christian teacher to analyze that for them and give them the truth, but these drawings are shown of the similarity of embryos of, say, a fish and a frog and a turtle and a chicken and man. And wow, they look similar. What the textbook may fail, not all of them, we've got some good textbooks out there, but what the textbook may fail to say is that Haeckel's drawings are outdated, and furthermore, many would assert that they are falsified, that Haeckel himself fudged. Plus he was 19th century, didn't have quite as much information about the embryo as we do now, didn't have the ability technologically to view what we can view now. And what we know is that Jonathan Wells, a molecular biologist, as I mentioned to you, who wrote the book called Icons of Evolution, what he says is that, interestingly enough, Haeckel took the intermediate stage of embryonic development, the one where they're most alike. If he had gone even farther back, earlier stages, he would have found they were even more dissimilar. So he did a couple of things here. One, he actually fudged them according to his bias, to make them look more similar. And we all have a tendency to do that. In fact, Christians are accused of doing that. But Haeckel did that with the drawings. And secondly, he used an intermediate stage, and if he had gone back even earlier, he would have found they were more different than more similar. And if he had drawn them to scale, as Jonathan Wells has done, then you would see that they're dramatically different. There's very little similarity. So there's not much evidence there. Unfortunately, these pictures they're public domain now and can be easily used. And that's one of the excuses that the folks that advocate this in the textbook say, well, they're copyright free, and so we're able to use them, and they still prove the main point. So we give them that, we don't argue with them. Oh, well, that's just one example. And if it was the only one, it wouldn't be that serious, but it's a problem. Secondly, though, we also have a problem with the Galapagos finches, because what we find is that this does not show evolution in process. Actually, it just shows oscillation of adaptation. It never leads to fundamentally new life forms. When drought comes, the beaks change, the animals adapt to their environment to survive. Those who do not adapt die off, and the survival of the fittest, those who are most fit for that environment, live. But that does not mean that fundamentally new life forms are produced in this process. That has not been shown.
It didn't turn into a monkey.
It did not turn into a monkey. And it didn't turn into a raven. It didn't turn into a buzzard, even. So this is very serious, and it's a very, very weak argument, and yet it was lauded as one of the greatest findings. Now, thirdly, the antibiotic-resistant bacteria. I've not done a lot of lab work. When I was a nurse in nursing school, we did some lab work, and you grow things in the little petri dishes, things like that in lab. But what scientists have found is that of course, you put antibiotics into that petri dish with the bacteria, and it kills off the bacteria. That's what we want antibiotics to do, so we can get feeling better. Unfortunately, what we find is that there will be a few resistant bacteria. Aha, they're stronger. Well, maybe then this with enough time, would change into a whole new species, a whole new different set of organisms of diverse forms.
It's a big leap.
Yeah, it's a big leap because what has been found is that when these bacteria, second generation bacteria, which are resistant, are put back with the parent bacteria, let's say the antibiotic is removed, they can't survive. So this is not a linear evolutionary move at all. They can't survive with their own parent bacteria. And so these examples that are being used are actually very weak. And then fourthly, the four-winged fruit fly.
Right.
It produced in the laboratory. There's a problem with that. When evolutionists say, well, see this four-winged fruit fly, look at the change that was produced by a mutation. Imagine random mutations are the engine, and if this four-winged fruit fly can show that kind of mutation, then it could, over enough time, develop into a whole new organism.
Right.
Okay? The problem is that is a laboratory setting. It's an artificially produced mutation in a control setting, and it cannot survive on its own. No other fruit fly will mate with it, so it can't reproduce.
Well,
it's a dead end.
Yeah, and not only that, it took intelligence to create that.
It took intelligence, manipulating,
right,
to produce that environment. Further, the two extra wings, dead as a doornail. They're like carrying extra baggage. They don't do anything. They're non-functional. This is a dead end evolution for evolutionists. This does not show a linear progressive change that can account for the big changes, the intermediate stages that would take a frog to a human.
Right.
Even no matter how much time there is. And then finally, the tree of life. The tree of life says that, as I mentioned before, that we began with one archetypal organism and it produced all these different diverse life forms. Homology is what is the similar bone structure. That's what we mean by similar bone structure. Scientists call it homology. A similarity in bone structure, they argue, shows that we come from the same ancestor. We are all living beings, progress from the same ancestor. The problem with that is, even though a wasp and a bee are similar in structure, that doesn't tell us the mechanism how they got that way. Now, Darwin said that if the bone structure of different vertebrates are similar, like a cat has a femur, a leg bone called a femur, or that functions like a femur, then we must all be coming from the same original genetic code. The problem is that the genetic code that produces those similar bone structures are not the same. We have learned. You see, we're now in the 21st century, and we're able to look at the cell. We're able to look at some of the causative factors, and Darwin's theory falls flat in the face of the newest scientific evidence, despite the fact that some scientists still say that it does not. They are not thinking through their own position.
Yeah.
And then finally, the fossil record is the other record that's often, the other example that's often used to support the tree of life. And Darwin postulated that over time, you know, all these diverse forms were produced. He didn't see it clearly in the fossil record, but he argued that over time, if we started sampling enough fossils, we would find these intermediate forms. Did we find them? We did not. What we have found is that there's a sudden burst in a certain strata of the rock layers called, supposedly from what is called by scientists the Cambrian age, that occurred at a certain point way back in history where diverse life forms appeared all at once. And even below that strata, see, Darwinists argued, well, maybe below that strata, just before it, there will be the intermediate forms. There are not. They said, well, maybe it's because those forms that preceded them are too soft-bodied. Not so. In China, fossils have been found of very sponge embryos, very soft-bodied forms, and even the muscles are able to be shown and are graphed in the fossils. It just does not support Darwinian theory. And just getting a grasp on some of these basics will help Christians to be able just to enter the arena of discussion.
Yeah. Well, and that's very good because I know this book, The Icons of Evolution, there are a lot of these icons that the book talks about, but of course we're limited here on the show with a certain amount of time, so we only went through a few of them. But how do you respond to someone? Because what happens is when you talk to someone who is an evolutionist or who doesn't believe that God created, they will say that, well, what you believe in that God created, that's not science. That's not scientific. You can't teach that in the school. You can't teach that in the classroom because it's not science.
Well, we have to realize that every scientist, whether naturalistic in his view or Christian in his view, enters a laboratory setting with a worldview. Every one of us has we have a way that we think the world began, whether it was came from a purposeful creator or whether it happened by chance. We all have an opinion. So let's not assume that only Christians enter the laboratory setting or to study evolution, the only ones with a worldview. Right. Everyone filters what they see in the data through their worldview. So what we have to ask as scientists is, objectively speaking, where does the evidence lead us? And as much as possible, be objective about that. Now, I believe, not as a scientist, but with a science background, that the evidence itself supports everything I see in the Bible.
Right.
But I say that having some scientific background upon which to base that. So we wouldn't want to argue that just because you're a naturalist that you can't see the evidence, nor would we want to argue that just because you're a Christian you can't see the evidence. So let's just be sure that we make that playing field level and say that everyone, humanist, of which naturalism and evolution is a premise, asked to be called a religion in 1961, and the Supreme Court gave them that. So we're not the only religious folks that come as scientists to this arena to discuss this topic. Right. All of us have a worldview.
The interesting thing about this, we're closing the show up now. I told you the time was going by fast. But the interesting thing is that although we are supposed to be the uneducated ones, that we are the ones who actually are looking at the true evidence. It is the evolutionists who are turning a blind eye to the evidence and just selectively looking at information to bolster up their own philosophy. So,
well, let's just say that there are many scientists out there who have questions about Darwinian evolution, the theory in itself, and there are scientists who are not believers who have the same questions.
Right. Tricia Scribner, thank you for being on my show, talking with me about the icons of evolution. And that will end this episode of Giving an Answer. Be sure to join me again next time. And until then, goodbye and God bless.